I'm Dominique White, a British Caribbean artist, originally from Essex in the UK, now living between France and Essex still. I work nomadically throughout Europe, and I'd say I'm predominantly a sculptor who's very invested in reimagining the future, Afro-pessimism through blackness, and undoing the nation state. I guess I'll probably start by saying I'm from a working class background, so being an artist was never truly a job that I could imagine. I had to essentially convince my family to go to art school. I did my BA at Goldsmiths in London, and that's the only qualification I actually have in the arts. And I kind of did this with the idea of, I guess, convincing my family that within a certain time frame, if I could make some sort of career pan out, I will kind of remain within the arts, or I would retrain and do something else. I would say that I kind of emerged in the London scene at the end of the DIY, I guess, movement that had kind of started in the late 80s and 90s. So I kind of emerged in this scene that was kind of still quite radical, also still quite romantic in regards to what being an artist or occupying the art scene was. I'd say that I'm happy I went to art school, but a lot of my training actually came after art school, outside of the institution. But I think that's also formed the way that I am as an artist, both politically and I guess like a physical formation. My practice is self-taught, whether that's from textbooks or at one point in the UK, I managed to get a grant from the Arts Council, which allowed me to learn, about model making, mold making with silicone and with jesmonite. But outside of that, it was actually a lot of exchanging with my community about skills. So a lot of my friends are also sculptors, so we spend a lot of time, I guess, exchanging ideas quite physically, like, oh, I can weave and you can make a jesmonite sculpture really easily. So if you teach each other how to do that, and that's where a lot of, I guess, my most important training came from, is from a very strong community who, I guess, really wanted to nurture who I am as a person, but also my practice. There was a lot of trust and a lot of passion within this community. And that's why I like to place myself in the end of the DIY scene, because it was more, I guess, about like the family that you chose, I guess, who nurtured you, as opposed to what it feels like now, where it feels a bit more kind of commercial, a bit more individual, when I find actually the most important thing in the art world is to have a strong community around you. At the time when I kind of left, there was like a strain basically, and there was a decision that I had to make. This was back in 2019, where I was essentially like hyper aware. If I stayed in London, I would probably have to quit art. You know, I was already working a 45, 50-hour week, as well as balancing a studio practice and doing the odd show. So when things started to kind of, I guess, culminate, where I was starting to be invited to do residencies, or I did my first commercial show in 2019, I kind of realized there was this imbalance. I was like, something has to give. And the thing that had to give was essentially where I was located. I was working predominantly in mainland Europe. I guess some of my first major shows were in Vienna and in Florence. Yeah, and also I was quite interested, I guess, in destabilizing the centers of art. I think with a lot of young artists, there is this pressure to always be in London or in Paris, or you have to go to New York. You can't be in Manchester or Leeds or Glasgow. Everyone, when you graduate, you have this idea that London is like the eye of the storm, basically. When really there are, I guess, so much more interesting conversations happening outside of that. It used to, I guess, be easier to be located in London because, of course, if there's an art fair or a major show, everyone descends there so you can meet people. But I don't really know how formative that is actually for many artists, or whether that provides actually a sustainable structure. Because also you realize actually there's so many artists, but actually the world is very small. It's just quite layered, you know. And as you start moving up those layers, you realize it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you're basically in a circle. And for me, that's not something I was really interested in. I mean, it suits some people, it did not suit me. I kind of had nothing to lose, because also I was at the bottom, if that made sense. I was like, what? I go back into working in a bar if it doesn't work out? The most straightforward way I like to describe my work is to say it looks like a ghostly shipwreck. They all kind of derive from, I guess, like this destroyed boat or this destroyed vessel, or these kind of tools that are associated with the nautical world. So I work a lot with, I guess, quite challenging materials, most notably being iron, which I must say, actually, all of the materials in my practice have like a lot of symbolism that they represent, which is not necessarily apparent. But for me, there's a particular reason why, for example, I use iron and not bronze or not steel, which are more, I guess, commercially accessible for artists. So iron, for example, was, I guess, like one of the most prominent materials used in, I guess, more historic shipbuilding outside of wood. But also, I guess, in terms of a very particular history, when I talk about, I guess, Afro-pessimism or blackness or Afrofuturism, in a shipwreck, the kind of iron ballasts are the only indicator that it was a slave ship. So there's usually nothing else that kind of denotes what kind of ship it is, except from these like very, I guess, like, yeah, specific objects that stand the test of time. I guess those specific materials like mahogany and iron that are kind of used to act as like the captor or I guess the hunter in a lot of my works, yeah, derive from, I guess, the fungibility of blackness. So these are materials that are kind of were exchangeable with the idea of the non-human. So mahogany is actually an almost extinct wood, and that is literally because it was over-harvested during slavery. So a lot of mahogany furniture that you find is from that era, but also kind of is sometimes interchanged with or intertwined, I should say, with, I guess, like the non-human body. So sometimes you find a lot of hair or sometimes skin in a lot of this furniture. So it kind of became synonymous, I guess, with this, I guess, with the non-human. I guess that's what I'm also, I should say, I'm interested in. I use both faux mahogany and real mahogany. It's an incredibly hard wood, so it splinters with time. You know, when you steam it to bend it, you see videos online where you can just steam it for, you know, like 10 minutes and then you put it in like a shape and it's perfect. Whereas mahogany, I'm steaming for like 8-9 hours at like 120 degrees. My studio is basically burning up. I'm sweating. And then it's like quite literally a battle to work with. These are materials that don't really want to be changed or they don't want to be solid. There's like an odd volatility to all of the materials. So, you know, the iron has started to rot and decay. It's technically still, would still call it a fluid metal, actually. It's still, as opposed to bronze, it's still in flux. So it's this kind of, I guess, mediation between, I guess, the material and myself. So the way that I work with kaolin, which, by the way, is a clay that is pretty much in everything around you. It's a very fascinating material that is quite overlooked. It's in paper, it's in paint, it's probably in the skincare you use in the morning, it's used in medicine, but it's also used a lot in historic fresco painting. It's pretty much in everything. So using it in this way is very unconventional because it's supposed to be like I guess a top layer as opposed to like the main body of a sculpture. It becomes this kind of paste that then obviously once the water evaporates, it becomes solid, but it means it's extremely brittle and fragile. So it kind of will always leave this presence in the space. Every time it's installed, there'll be slight fragments that will kind of break off. And it's kind of why I talk about them in like a kind of ghostly, but also like autonomous way. They kind of do feel like they're breathing beasts in themselves. You can walk around the work and then it means the work starts to expand beyond, I guess, the perimeters of what you would consider to be the work. And sometimes you even take it home with yourself. It's quite like a rebellious, yeah. So I talk about when in regards to like, I guess, like rebellious object making, it kind of defies this idea of this like very specific form, like this is the perimeters of this object that can sit on a plinth or be put behind glass. I kind of, yeah, I'm really anti, I guess, that museum language, and that's why I use these materials, because it's like, you know, even the rust will start to disintegrate and mix with the clay, or in some shows there's almost like a shadow of rust on the floor. Hierarchy, I think the main definition was formed in 1631 by someone called Richard Braithwaite, and it basically denotes a sea vessel and the power that it kind of controls over land. So it was kind of formed at that time to kind of, I guess, describe the movement of sea vessels from Italy, from, I guess, the Netherlands at the time, and Spain and Portugal across to Africa to the US, kind of seeing how that power shifted. And without, I guess, the power of the ship, how none of that would have happened. I guess is why places like Genoa in Italy are so historically important, but we now kind of overlook. They were an incredibly powerful navy, and it's also where Christopher Columbus comes from. It's like a very loaded city that has kind of now just become overcome with pesto and delicious delicacies, when really it's like I guess it was like one of the world powers that was like led by the ship. And I guess my interest is in like below, I guess it's like how the ship is used to, I guess, undo power on land. And it's mostly through, I guess, piracy, it's through rioters, it's through runaway slaves, and those that kind of defy, I guess, the hierarchy of what power is on land. I think some of the most interesting stories that I was researching, I guess, through this period was actually when pirates started to kind of undo this power or threaten this power on land in the late 1600s and 1700s. There really was a moment when they were, I guess, fearful that this project of the nation state would quickly become undone, because on these ships, actually, they had formed their own mini nation states where everyone had equal power. They spoke a language that no one else could speak, which are now all lost or have now become, I guess, Caribbean patois and or pidgin in a lot of cases. It's kind of this defiance to be categorized. And I guess that's why I talk about, I guess, this rebellion or abolition through, I guess, the perspective of Black liberation, because that's the only perspective that I can really, I guess, like grapple with. But also this idea that true liberation, I guess, of anyone or anything cannot happen until Black liberation is truly realized. So we're going to be stuck in this kind of cycle of hierarchy, essentially, as we're witnessing mostly with the US, with the UK. This struggle to like retain this power that has been formed by the vessel that we tend to overlook. You know, this is Trump's obsession with the Panama Canal. This is Trump's obsession with Greenland. It's about this movement of vessels around the world. We have to look to the sea to understand how, I guess, like power on land can change. So now we're seeing this new age of colonialism and this like new aspiration for, I guess, like capital to kind of surpass like its current limitations, right? So, you know, we were talking about, well, Elon Musk is talking about colonizing Mars. I don't think you can reform essentially these kind of ideals. I don't think you can reform capitalism. I think it's working as it's supposed to work, essentially. And it requires all of us to essentially stand in line and believe in this attainable dream, for example. Like, you know, when people criticize people who criticize billionaires, when they're like, they work really hard, you should just put up your fucking bootstraps. And it's like, well, you're never going to become a billionaire, because it requires you to exploit hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to kind of essentially get there. There is no ethical way to do this. And it means all of us can't become rich, essentially. Some of us have to lose this game, but the losers are also required to remain within the game, essentially. So this idea of Afrofuturism, that I understand it, emerged in the 60s through the jazz musician Sun Ra, when he was talking about a black planet, essentially. He was like, Black people will get on this rocket ship, you know, rockets are a thing now, and we'll go to this planet and we'll live in peace. But kind of ignoring this idea that also at the same time, the very, I guess, reason for, I guess, like Black oppression would also come hunting for this Black planet. So when we talk about futurity, it's always seen as this very romantic, unattainable idea that we'll all be holding hands and war will be over. But in order for that to happen, these very, I guess, like strict pillars of what society is would have to collapse. So in my opinion, there is actually no future under the current, I guess, conditions of society. So in order to imagine a future, or I guess a sense of utopia, it has to come from the destruction of those pillars of society. And this kind of reimagining of what a society is, of what a human is. And then I kind of, I guess, shifted from, I guess, like the jazz, or I guess like the really romantic ideas of Afrofuturism into, I guess, what Detroit techno kind of teaches of futurism. And that kind of came through Drexciya, came through underground resistance. And they basically talk about, I guess, quite literally resisting as opposed to running away. They talk about, I guess, destroying, and I guess living through the ruins of which is essentially what Detroit is, essentially. That's how their kind of futurism came into play. They were like, we are living in the ruins of capitalism. You know, America has let our city kind of fall apart, destroy itself, especially after the age of industrialism that kind of bled through the city. That's where the aquatic, I guess, comes through in my work as well. It's not also just my obsession with the sea or growing up near the sea or being from the Caribbean. It's also like, you know, they were like, if I am thrown overboard, maybe I can learn how to breathe underwater. This show is like the second iteration of the Hydra series, which is based on the myth of the Hydra, this kind of many-headed beast, and this, I guess, Hercules slaying this many-headed beast. And in the first iteration, which was Hydra Decapita, which came before it, it was about, I guess, like the severing and cauterizing of the heads of this many-headed beast. But in Cinders of the Wreck, it was this kind of this idea, or I guess this retelling of the story, in which at the end of the story, there is one head that remains immortal. So it's this idea that perhaps this cycle cannot be broken. And, you know, it's something that, as I said before, that we're seeing emerge again, you know, from this idea of progress. You know, in the US, we're like, you know, we had the first black president. Despite all the terrible things that he also did, it was seen as like, you know, 3 steps forward, to then be followed by Donald Trump, which is maybe like 45 steps back, you know? So I became disillusioned with this idea of living through this cycle, but then also became quite pessimistic in this idea that this cycle could actually even be broken. So I guess that's why shipwrecking I use as like a metaphor for abolition. It's proposing that you do not live, I guess, in the wrecks of the remains of the ship. It's this kind of pulverization. It's this, I think, this is also why I tend to use, I guess, music a lot as like a accessible form of imagining, I guess, what this looks like. And I tend to reference a lot of hip hop. So I guess, like, if you look to Busta Rhymes of the early thousands, when he was just like, Flip Mode Squad will reign supreme, and it's like music videos of him just destroying the world. It's kind of this idea that you kind of can't, as I said, you can't rebuild from existing structures. Something new has to happen. But as I said, like, you know, it feels like these are just the heads of the Hydra. If you just cut them off, you have to completely pulverize the body before, it regenerates.